On the other side of the court, Justices Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor all pointedly raised the same issue today in slightly different ways. Obviously, there was long arguments. There was a lot of different points made, but I was struck by the fact that Sotomayor and Breyer and Kagan all made this point, questioned essentially their fellow justices about what it will do to the perceived legitimacy of the court if, in fact, they overturn Roe. Not because that would be unpopular. I mean, it would be very unpopular. A large majority of the country says don't overturn Roe. That has been true for decades. It is still true now. But the more liberal justices today effectively made this argument that the court is going to have a real problem on its hands if they overturn Roe, not because that would be an unpopular decision, even though it would be. It would be a problem for the court if they overturn Roe because Roe is settled precedent. Nothing about the country has changed since Roe that would meaningfully affect the terms on which Roe was settled. Nothing about the Constitution has changed since Roe that would meaningfully affect the terms on which Roe was settled. Nothing about science has changed enough to materially impact the way that Roe was decided. None of those things have changed in any way materially that would warrant throwing out generations of settled precedent around which Americans have built their lives and their expectations for what it means to be a free person living in this country. If the only reason to throw out that settled precedent is because, hey, Brett's here now, then won't that make Americans think that the court actually isn't about looking at the law and it isn't just about looking at the Constitution? It's just like a little mini Congress with robes on, and it's about Republicans putting together enough votes for their chosen policy preferences, or Democrats putting enough votes together for theirs. Here's how the Washington Post editorial board made that case today in an editorial that was published after the arguments concluded. You see the headline there, "Gutting Roe would devastate millions of Americans and the court itself." Quote, "Very little has changed since the court handed down Roe, aside from the fact that Americans now rely on their right to choose whether to terminate a pregnancy. The shift since Roe has been the makeup of the court, reshaped after the addition of several conservative justices due to a mixture of underhanded politics and pure happenstance. The court's authority derives not from its ability to enforce its declarations. It lacks any such power. The court's authority derives from the fact that Americans respect its decisions. Those decisions must reflect something greater than mere whim or raw political power in the Senate. The justices should have no illusions. A partial or total reversal of Roe would devastate not only the Americans who rely on the abortion rights that have been theirs for nearly 50 years, but it would also be devastating for the court itself, undermining its legitimacy." That is how the Washington Post puts it tonight. Here's how the more liberal justices put it today in court.
General, Justice Breyer started with stare decisis, an important principle in any case, and here, for the reasons that Casey mentioned, especially so, to prevent people from thinking that this court is a political institution that will go back and forth depending on what part of the public yells loudest, and preventing people from thinking that the court will go back and forth depending on changes to the court's membership.
We have to have public support, and that comes primarily from people believing that we do our job, we use reason, we don't look to just what's popular, and that's where we've seen the paradox. The problem with the super case like this, the rare case, the watershed case, where people are really opposed on both sides, and they really fight each other, is they're going to be ready to say, no, you're just political, you're just politicians. And that's what kills us as an American institution.
Now, the sponsors of this bill, the House bill in Mississippi, said we're doing it because we have new justices. The newest ban that Mississippi has put in place, the 6-week ban, the Senate sponsor said we're doing it because we have new justices on the Supreme Court. Will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts. I don't see how it is possible. If people actually believe that it's all political, how will we survive?
Will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception? But the court has nothing to do with the actual law and the Constitution. It's just about who's got political power in Washington, and our rights don't count for anything beyond that. The headlines about the Supreme Court case today were essentially unanimous. The broad perception, at least, and maybe the broad perception will be wrong, we'll see, but the broad perception, at least, both expert and lay observers believe that the Republican-appointed conservative anti-abortion supermajority on the Supreme Court is going to do what it was put there for. They appear to be ready to either outright overturn Roe versus Wade or gut it so much that it doesn't mean much of anything anymore anyway. And I mean, here in the real world, particularly those of us outside the sort of legal academy, we can see that, right, as the predictable outcome of what Republicans and conservatives have been working on for years, for decades, to remake the judiciary in such a way that what happened today was the death of a right foretold, right? I mean, they'll put a Scott Lloyd in an administration job he's not qualified for, but once he's in that job, he'll, track girls' periods on a spreadsheet and physically lock them up to prevent them from being able to go get themselves an abortion to which they are technically legally entitled to. But they'll also put a Brett Kavanaugh on the court in order to do the judicial equivalent of that, because they can each be counted on for that same reason, for that same purpose, and that's why they were given the jobs they were given. To those of us outside of the legal world, and those of us sort of, I think, operating in a realpolitik environment, we already see it that way. But to hear all three liberal justices today tell the rest of the court, tell the other justices, sort of in the same language, in the same way, hey, if you do this, this will be the end of the court as we know it. This court, which doesn't have a police force, this court, which doesn't have a budget, this court, which doesn't have any way to enforce its rulings other than the fact that the American people believe that we interpret the law based on the Constitution and our rulings are binding, you will weaken that, and the country will no longer believe that about us as a court if you do what you are setting out to do here. To hear all three liberal-leaning justices make that argument today to their colleagues, well, do they know something we don't about how that argument will land with their colleagues and about what those justices might be afraid of? Whether those justices might actually be afraid to do what they were put there to do.